Michael, how are you, sir?
Great to be back, Glenn.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your hard work on this.
Well, thank you for having me on. I'm excited to talk about it.
Okay, so tell me what you have found. What's true, what's not true?
Well, look, what we know is that this is somebody who, according to multiple witnesses, including the mother of his children, was struggling with mental illness for over a decade. We know he was homeless for a while. We know there was extensive drug use. You know, mental illness, serious mental illness like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are pretty rare, but we do see a lot of drug-induced mental illness, and particularly from methamphetamine use, but certainly other drugs over time can cause psychosis, which is, of course, the classic insanity of not being able to tell the difference between reality and your imagination. And so what's obvious here is that the alleged suspect in the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband was in the grip of psychosis. And to blame political ideology is just what you said. It's the equivalent of blaming Martin Scorsese for making the movie Taxi Driver on John Hinckley Jr.'s attack on Ronald Reagan. It's the crazy ideas expressed in the blog posts of the alleged attacker of Pelosi are themselves symptoms of the underlying psychosis. It's incorrect to point to them as the cause.
I heard this morning that he is in the hospital, or was this weekend. Were those for injuries, or is he in a psych ward?
I don't know. It could be both. I think if he's, he wouldn't be hospitalized long term if he's in the hospital. He'll be held. He'll be diagnosed by a psychiatrist, and we'll find out soon. I mean, I think that the good news is that the truth gets out. It was obvious to me because, of course, I'm very close to this. I wrote a whole book about this. Came out last year. It was obvious to me as soon as I heard about who he was and started talking to his neighbors and his family members that this was somebody that was unwell, and this was a result of a sickness. I was disturbed by how quickly even so-called mainstream journalists were to basically go and blame conservatives, blame Republicans, blame Trump. If somebody were to be like, I read Michael Shellenberger's book, and that's why I committed this crime, it would be inappropriate to blame me for that crime. And I think everybody knows that, but in this toxic political environment, I think it's important to remind people of that.
We never blamed Bernie Sanders, ever. In fact, we were clear on day one that it wasn't Bernie Sanders' fault that one of his supporters went and tried to kill all the Republicans in Congress.
Right.
It's ridiculous.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, I was sorry to see it. I mean, basically, I had one episode in particular. There's a reporter who supposedly focused on disinformation at NBC News, who came out and he tweeted at my reporting and said, my reporting had been debunked because there's all these blog posts showing that the suspect in the attack had written crazy things, including some right-wing things, but also things about fairies and demons. And I found it very disturbing because I have a hard time believing that journalist didn't know that what was driving the suspect was mental illness or psychosis. It really appeared that he was deliberately misleading people in order to engage in partisan political behavior just 10 days before an election. And it's not just on Twitter. I mean, if you watch Meet the Press yesterday, Chuck Todd's program on NBC, the whole program was basically dedicated to this topic, and at no point in any of the program did they even discuss the fact that the suspect was clearly in a psychotic state, suffering from delusions, under long-term drug use. Instead, Chuck Todd made the whole show about political radicalization and ideas, and I just think that's terrible reporting. I think it's very partisan. I won't speculate as to the motives of the journalists, but it's either bad journalism or it's motivated by politics.
Is it worse that they did that, or that when Kavanaugh, the guy from California, came to kill Kavanaugh, they didn't even report it on any of the Sunday morning shows?
Well, I mean, that's the other thing, and I wrote a post about this yesterday, Glenn, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it's disturbing. I didn't really, I saw when the Kavanaugh assassination happened, of course, I paid attention to it, But I'll say this, there are many progressive and liberal people in my life who still do not know that there was a serious assassination plot against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh because it was not covered in anything close to this. So just as you said, 3 days after that assassination plot was revealed, none of the Sunday talk shows wrote about it. The New York Times buried the story on page A20. The Pelosi alleged assassination attempt was on the front page of the New York Times 2 days in a row. And I'll tell you the other thing about it is that the suspect in the Kavanaugh killing was clearly motivated by his pro-choice and his pro-gun control views, and his own lawyers last week said that he was mentally fit to stand trial. In other words, it appears, and again, there's still more information to come, and I don't want to get ahead of it, but it appears as though the suspect in the Kavanaugh plot was genuinely motivated by political fanaticism, not by mental illness, whereas in the Pelosi case, he clearly was driven by psychosis, mental illness, drug-induced or underlying, we don't know. But the media basically reversed those two stories and did not and covered the Pelosi plot attempt as though it were driven by political fanaticism rather than by psychosis.
It really is incredible. You are from the area, Michael, and you were down there, right? These are some of these interviews we've seen. You were there, right? Is that accurate? Yeah.
I was. I mean, I think it's. I'm a journalist at heart, and so it's not that far from my house. And I went down there and I interviewed all the neighbors. I mean, I'll tell you a couple of shocking things. I won't name names, but I was not impressed by the reporting of the other journalists. Good journalism is that you go and knock on all the doors and you interview as many people as you can. I was the only one doing that. There was a lot of laziness here. There's a lot, and it's also the partisanship and the laziness are related because if you have the idea that this was, a Trump supporter who went after Pelosi, then you don't want to go and get to the bottom of the other stuff. You don't want to go do those interviews. You want to stick with your little story. So that was part of it. And then, it's a really, when you get into it, Glenn, as you might imagine, it's a tragic story. I mean, it's drug use, it's pedophilia. The mother of his two kids is in prison for basically child molestation. She was a crazy person. So she herself is something, I think she probably has a personality disorder and also long-term drug use. The kids are in that house. They apparently weren't going to school. I mean, this is a real, it's basically a symptom of exactly the problems I described in San Fransicko, which is that we've stopped enforcing basic laws. And when you stop enforcing laws against people that are suffering mental illness or addicted to hard drugs, they don't get the help they need. And I think that's part of the lesson here is that this tragedy could have been averted if we enforced basic laws and mandated drug treatment and psychiatric care for the people who need it. It's not that every time you arrest somebody for breaking a law that they have to go to prison or they have to be punished. Certainly some people do. But other people are just sick, and I think I think what we'll discover as time goes on is that the suspect in the Pelosi attack was somebody who was very ill and needed to get treatment mandated many, many years ago, but didn't get it because we're in the grip of, frankly, some pretty radical left political ideas.
Did you see the op-ed by, who was it? Lost his name. The guy who just wrote this weekend about the op-ed about Tom Cotton at the New York Times and how he's an op-ed columnist and he even didn't say anything about it. He said because we were afraid to. When you said a minute ago that they don't want to find it, how many are afraid to do their job in journalism?
Well, I was afraid. I mean, I think there's a lot of, my story. I mean, I came from the radical left. I consider myself a moderate. I'm politically independent. But, I was afraid on everything. And, partly you worry about losing your friends. You worry about upsetting your family. You worry about no longer being able to make a living. And, what you're describing is a column by Washington Post reporter Eric Wemple, who writes a media column. And he basically, to his credit, There was an ambivalent reaction to it, interestingly enough. But basically, to his credit, he came out and said it was wrong for the New York Times to fire its op-ed page editor, who ran, of course, this op-ed by Senator Cotton arguing for the use of the National Guard and U.S. troops to put down the riots. Well, he was not only did the New York Times, because of the outrage by its woke journalist staff, they basically denounced the op-ed. They fired the op-ed page editor. Everybody watched this happen and knew it was wrong. And, so to his credit, whatever it was, like 2 years ago now, this columnist of the Washington Post said that was wrong. I think it's good that, it's better late than never, and he's one of the first people to say it. But yeah, I mean, it's almost it's a kind of, it's social fear. You're worried about your friends and your family, but it's also a financial fear, like, am I going to get fired from my job? This is really serious stuff, and I think that the partisanship, and you always emphasize this, I think it's so important. We need to allow disagreement in our society. We need to appreciate and reward it. I'm always shocked by how many people, instead of being like, oh, I disagree with you, they're like, you should stop saying that.
Right.
There's this desire to get people to be quiet.
Right. We're with Michael Shellenberger. We're going to get some more facts on, I've just got a few questions on just the facts on what's true, what's not true. And then I also want to talk to him about this push by the Democrats to nationalize our gas and oil. Hello, Venezuela. We'll go there in 60 seconds. So I think, Michael, because you have experience in your family with schizophrenia, I think it was your aunt?
Yes.
Yes. So you've seen it firsthand. Can you?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Of course, when you're a child, and she would say crazy things, and so your parents have to explain to you what's going on. And it is a little scary. Of course, it helps to have your parents there to kind of talk you through it. But yeah, she thought that the president of the United States, I think at the time it was Ford and Nixon, that they were communicating with her directly through the television set. So I think that there's a reaction that people have to this case where they go, okay, maybe he was psychotic, but there's all these terrible conspiracy theories out there, and those need to stop. Well, no. First of all, we have freedom of speech, and that means that we actually let people have conspiracy theories. We let people believe all sorts of things. That's a point of a free society. So the idea that we're going to get rid of certain ideas is a very bad road to go down. But the other thing is just that psychotic people will always find some justification for their behaviors. That's different than suggesting that those are the motivations. I do think this is something that people can get, but they have to think about it for a minute, which is that, and we know this is true for everybody, right, is that, like, you have a motivation to do something, but you might give a different reason for why you did it.
Right.
Well, people that are psychotic, they give crazier reasons often. But in many cases, like I look at this case and I suspect, Glenn, that what we'll discover is that this is somebody who was, he's lost. He lost his wife and kids. He wasn't able to hold down a good job. He was using heavy drugs. His motivation was probably to somehow make his life better, as crazy as that sounds.
No, I know.
To be a hero or something like that. He had some story in his head about how he was going to become a hero this is how often these guys think, by making this attack. And that's ultimately what was driving it, not some political radicalization.
So there are a few things about the story that I don't know if they're true or not. I look at these things, and the reason why we have a plethora of conspiracy theories is because we no longer trust the media, we no longer trust the government to tell us anything close to the truth. And then there are these things that just kind of hang out in the air, and nobody explains them, and it doesn't fit in with the storyline that the media is going for. First of all, does that make sense to you? You think that's right?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, look, the media, they're partisan now,
right?
And maybe they've always been. Although I do think there's no doubt that it's gotten worse.
Yeah, much worse. So
when this happened, they rushed to make this a story about why you should not vote for Republicans. I mean, it's just sort of tragic.